Welcome to today's continued session, Imagining Others, with Professor Amy Kind. Dr. Kind is the Russell K. Pitzer Professor of Philosophy here at Claremont McKenna College. She joined the faculty community in 1997. Dr. Kind's research interest lies broadly in the philosophy of mind, but most of her work centers on issues relating to imagination and phenomenal consciousness. So I was lucky enough to hear a version of this talk earlier this week at the Athenaeum, and I can tell you that I'm sure you'll all really enjoy it. It's really great. And thank you all for coming, and let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Kind.
Hi, thanks for coming. It's so nice out. I'm surprised people want to be inside. I just was walking around enjoying the weather. Yes, cheers. So I actually, as was just said, I gave this as a talk at a lunchtime presentation at the Athenaeum earlier this week. So it is sort of set up as a talk. It goes about half an hour, 35 minutes. So I think I'll just plan to do it as a talk and then take questions afterwards for the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. But if you have a burning question while I'm talking or I say something that you don't understand, you can interrupt and ask a question. But otherwise, I think I'll just plan to run through it as a talk. So I guess I'll start, and this is something that we commonly do now in our classes, but some people do in their classes, but I'll just start with a content warning just to let you know that I'm going to be using a few examples that sometimes people find they just want warning about, that such examples are coming. So I'm going to use a couple of examples relating to sexual assault, relating to grief, and relating to race and racial violence. So just so you know they're coming, I'm not going to talk about anything in great detail, but these kinds of examples are used in the talk. Okay, so the basic question, I should say, as a background, my research is on imagination, and I've been writing on imagination for my whole career here, and took a little break now and then, but lately I've been sort of full power on imagination, and so this talk brings together some of the different work that I've been doing lately and that I've been thinking lately. And so the basic question that's motivating the talk is whether we can have access to experiential perspectives other than our own. So whether there's a way for us to bridge what often seems to be an unbridgeable divide, between people. And so if we look to popular culture, I think there's a lot of evidence that the answer to this question is no, that we can't bridge this divide, that we can't have access to experiential questions, experiential perspectives other than our own. And we actually see this again in the popular culture domain with respect to a lot of different kinds of examples, a lot of different kinds of experiential perspectives. So this, I don't know your musical taste, but this is a still from a Lady Gaga video from her song, Till It Happens to You. This is a song about sexual assault, and it actually there was a competition a couple of years ago where a cappella groups at colleges were performing it, and the 5C a cappella group, the after-school specials, I think did extremely well in the competition, maybe even won. So if you want to hear a rendition of this song, you don't have to hear Lady Gaga's. You can Google the after-school specials, and they do a really great rendition of this song, and they really bring out some of the issues about sexual violence, sexual assault, and the idea expressed in the lyrics, which are Lady Gaga's, is that if you haven't been the victim of sexual assault, you can't know what it's like to have had this experience. So till it happens to you, you don't know how it feels, and it won't be real to you. How could you know? And moreover, just to look at some of the other lyrics, this isn't the whole song, these are just selected lyrics, but Lady Gaga also says, till you're standing in my shoes, I don't want to hear nothing from you because you don't know. Okay, so this is one expression of the idea that we can't have access to an experiential perspective other than our own. If you haven't gone through this type of experience, you can't know what it's like. So here's another example from Hamilton. I actually got to see Hamilton last year. Yeah, out here. But it was a really stressful moment because the tickets were going on sale, I think, at 9, and I taught at 11, and I got in the online queue at 9, and I was watching the hourglass go, and I finally got the tickets at 10:53, and then zoomed down to teach my class. So it was very exciting. But in any case, this is one of the musical numbers from Hamilton. This is called It's Quiet Uptown, and in the play, Hamilton's son is killed in a duel, and Hamilton and his wife are there after suffering from the loss of a child, grief from the loss of a child. So the lyrics to this song suggest that this kind of grief is unimaginable. We can't imagine it. Not just that we don't want to, but we can't imagine this kind of grief if we haven't experienced it. Okay, and we also see this quite frequently in discussions of race relations in America. So this is a quote from the poet Claudia Rankine. Claudia Rankine was actually formerly a professor at Pomona College. She's no longer there. But in this op-ed, which I think is a very powerful statement, she said, though the white liberal imagination likes to feel temporarily bad about black suffering, there is really no mode of empathy that can replicate the daily strain of knowing that as a black person you can be killed for simply being black. No hands in your pockets, no playing music, no sudden movements, no driving your car, no walking at night, no walking in the day, no turning into this street, no entering this building, no standing your ground, no standing here, no standing there, no talking back, no playing with toy guns, no living while black. And so the idea behind this passage, right, is that we can't, no matter how empathetic we are, those of us who are not African American cannot know this kind of experience that African Americans undergo in America today. We see this idea in academic writing as well. So the academic Paul Gilroy in his book After Empire says racial difference obstructs empathy and makes ethnocentrism inescapable. It becomes impossible even to imagine what it's like to be someone else. And it's this last claim that I really want to focus on today in my talk. This idea that we can't imagine what it's like to be someone else. So I'm going to call this claim the epistemic inaccessibility claim. I tried to keep this talk jargon-free. I know epistemic, that's my main piece of jargon. Epistemic means of or relating to knowledge. So when I talk about epistemic inaccessibility, I mean you can't have knowledge access to the experiential perspectives of another. That's the claim that is the target of my talk. And so the claim is that experiential, my kids were actually at my talk when I was giving it at the AF earlier this week. They're 14 and 11. And then they went back to school and all their friends were saying, why weren't you at school today? And my younger son, who's 11, was telling his friends, oh, I heard my mom give a talk. And they said, well, what was it on? And he said, epistemic inaccessibility. So I was very proud. That was like a proud mama moment. I don't know if he then could explain what it meant, but he at least remembered the words, yes.
Isn't the whole point of art to give others the access to your own experiences?
Ah, you're stealing my thunder. So, so great anticipation of how one way that we might answer this, and I'm going to suggest that one thing on the other side is turning to literature and art. So yes, if you're thinking that, then you're already converted to my position, which is great. I am arguing against the epistemic inaccessibility claim. I'm going to argue against the claim. I'm not quite going to go so far as to say we can know, like if you haven't been sexually assaulted, you can know, or if you haven't experienced the loss of a child, you can know. I'm not going to go so far as to say that, but I want to at least suggest that the arguments that are offered for this claim are not as strong as they're often taken to be. And I'm going to suggest that we're better off aiming for access, trying to have access, and that perhaps in some circumstances we can have access. And literature is one important tool for that. Okay, so the claim, as I say, that's my target is that we can't have access and that we can't imagine what these other experiences are like. And so I guess I just said this, that I don't think we should be so easily convinced of the truth of this epistemic inaccessibility claim. And so I want to talk about whether we have good reason to believe it. Okay, so I think that normally there are two different kinds of arguments that we hear offered for this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophical literature, but it's not going to get too much into the weeds of philosophy. I think that if you were to try to flesh out for yourselves why this claim might be true, you would probably give similar reasons to those that philosophers have given. So there are basically two classes of arguments, and one has to do with there being too big a gulf between these perspectives, and the other has to do with there being a certain lack of humility in assuming that we can know about perspectives that we haven't had, that we haven't ourselves experienced. So I want to talk about both of these arguments and think a little bit about whether these are good arguments. Spoiler alert, right? I'm going to suggest they're not good arguments. That's where I'm going. So I'm going to start with what I'm calling the too big a gulf argument. The idea behind this argument is that there's just too big a gulf between, say, the experiential perspective of someone who has been the victim of sexual assault and someone who has never undergone sexual assault, or someone who suffered the loss of a child versus someone who hasn't. And those of you, probably most of you, who are not philosophers, maybe all of you, I know there's at least one person in the room that's taken a class of mine, so just one? Just one, okay. But in any case, you might be puzzled by the background image here. Just to say why I'm using this particular background image, in philosophy, the too big a gulf argument comes from a very famous paper by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, who is now a professor emeritus at NYU. And he wrote a paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And in the paper, he argued that we have no way of knowing what it's like to be a bat. So he wasn't actually interested specifically in the question that I'm interested in today. He was interested in questions about the nature of the mind and whether the mind can be physically explained. But he used this example of the experience of a bat to suggest that there are some kinds of experiences, conscious experiences, that we as humans don't have access to. So we can't imagine what it's like to be a bat. And when Nagel chooses the example of a bat, it's a very deliberate one, because he wants to pick an animal where we have a strong sense that the animal does have conscious experiences, right? So if he picked like a spider, you might think, well, I don't really know if a spider has conscious experiences. So he picks an animal that's a mammal, right? So sufficiently sophisticated such that we are inclined to think that the animal does have conscious experiences, but bats are really, really different from human beings, right? And they navigate the world really, really differently from the way that human beings navigate the world. They navigate the world by way of echolocation. And that's a sense that we don't have. So he picks an animal that, although we're pretty confident it has conscious experience, as confident as we can be, we really don't have access to that kind of conscious experience. So Nagel says that we can't really experience anything like what a bat does when the bat is using its echolocation, so we can't know what it's like to be a bat. And moreover, since we can't experience it, Nagel thinks that it's closed off to us in imagination. So he says, sure, you can imagine that you're hanging upside down by your feet, or you have webbing on your arms, or whatever. You have very poor eyesight and so on. But that doesn't really get us to what it's like to be a bat. So he says that our own experiential resources are limited. We don't have what we need to get the imagination going. And he says also that we can't imagine it by, say, by imagining additions or subtractions or modifications to our current experience. It's just too different from the kind of experiences we have. And Nagel does actually extend this. So he's not just interested in this exotic case of the bat. The gulf between a human and a bat is wider than the gulf between any two people, between any one person and another, no matter how many different experiences they have, or no matter how different the experiential perspectives that they occupy. But Nagel is explicit that this same kind of gap often occurs between people. And so in particular, he talks about the gulf between someone who's born without the senses of sight and hearing, so someone who's born blind and deaf compared to someone who is hearing and seeing. So that's the example that's up here on the slide. Now I want to point out that this is a particularly dramatic case. And even Nagel, who says, oh, we can't imagine what it's like to be a bat, and points to this kind of gulf, he actually is explicit that we can have epistemic access to other people's experiences in some cases. So he says, and this is often ignored in the article, it's often possible to take up a point of view other than one's own. So the comprehension of such facts is not limited to one's own case. So he reins in his conclusion. He does suggest that sometimes we can know things about other people's experiences, types of experiences that are different from our own. So the question becomes, if it is often possible, the question becomes when? When is it possible, right? When can we do it? And what Nagel says is that the more, and this is not rocket science here, this is what you would expect, the more different from oneself the other experiencer is, the less success one can expect with this enterprise. So for Nagel, what matters is how different we are from one another and how big a gulf there is between us. So in thinking about this, right, it helps to return to why he said we can't do the imaginative work with respect to a bat, why there's a failure when we try to imagine what it's like to be a bat. And there he had said, I didn't have this quote previously on the slide, but I talked about some of it. He had said that when we try to imagine what it's like to be a bat, we're restricted to the resources of our own minds, and these resources are inadequate to the task. I cannot perform it either by imagining additions to my present experience, or by imagining segments gradually subtracted from it, or by imagining some combination of additions, subtractions, and modifications. So the thought here seems to be that we need to find some way to leverage the experiences that we've had to get to experiences that we haven't. So we can use various tools, imaginative tools of addition and subtraction and so on, to get to experiences that we have not had. So now in my work, I call this process the process of imaginative scaffolding. And I think this process is really powerful, and it's one that does, in just regular everyday life, it allows us epistemic access to all sorts of experiences that we haven't had before. So one argument that's gained some currency in philosophy, which is in philosophical circles, there was this book published called Transformative Experience, and the author, Lori Paul, who's a professor of philosophy at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she argued that we can't know what you can't know what it's like to be a parent before you become a parent, and thus, and here's the kicker, she says you can't rationally choose to have a child because you don't know what it's going to be like, so you can't make a rational decision one way or the other, right? Either way, you just can't make a rational decision. So there's been a lot of discussion about this argument and a lot of talk about the rationality of decision making and so on. But I'm really interested in this claim that you can't know what it's like to be a parent before you are a parent. And what Lori Paul is claiming is that one aspect of her argument is that parental love is very different from any other kind of love. So we can't know what parental love is like. She has other aspects of her argument too, but that's one thing she mentions. And I don't have time to go through her whole argument. It's actually really interesting. You can find some popularized treatments of it if you're interested. I mean, or you could just read the book, Transformative Experience, if you want to read a philosophy book. But I want to put pressure on, in my work, I try to put pressure on the thought that there's too big a gulf between the non-parent and the parent by suggesting that we can use imaginative scaffolding to get to parental love. So if you've experienced other kinds of love, and there are lots of kinds of love, but if you've experienced romantic love, or you've experienced love of a sibling, or maybe you have a canine companion, and so you have love for your Labrador Retriever, or your Labradoodle, or something like that, all these different kinds of love you can piece together and pull little bits, and you can get from, say, romantic love, or romantic love and sibling love, and love of your canine companion, or your feline companion, or whatever. You can use the process of imaginative scaffolding of addition and subtraction and all the rest to get from romantic love to parental love. We can talk about this in discussion, but I'm always interested in hearing whether people did successfully imagine what it was like to be a parent. So I'll come back to this later, but I'm always interested in reflections. Often I get some people saying, like, no, I had no idea whatsoever what it was going to be like. Sometimes they're saying that disparagingly. That is, I wish I'd known what I was getting myself into. I'm not so sure I would do it. And sometimes people find it to be like better, than they expected, so much more powerful, much more moving. And then also I do often have some people who tell me, yeah, I worked hard to think about what it was going to be like to be a parent before I did it, and I was able to know what it was like before I became a parent. I was able to access that experience. My experience is very much like I thought it was going to be. Anyway, I'd be curious to hear your own thoughts on that as we get there. But the point is that I think there are cases in which we can use imaginative scaffolding to get to experiences that we haven't had. And so for the purposes of this talk, can we use imaginative scaffolding to cross these kinds of experiential perspectives? So cases of sexual assault, or of grief, or of racial divides. And I think it's interesting that in the kinds of cases that Nagel says explicitly that we can't have experiential access to different perspectives, they all involve cases of different sensory experiences, right? So like we don't have the sense of echolocation, or if you're born blind, you can't know what it's like to be a seeing person, or if you're born seeing, you can't know what it's like to be a blind person. And so those cases all have something very specific in common about your mode of access to the world, about your sensory access to the world. And I think we should be wary about overgeneralizing from these types of cases. But we do often see people generalizing from these sorts of cases. So philosophers say things like, no amount of imagination in the world can make it the case that one has the subjective imprimatur of the experiences and memories of another. But now, to say this, right, to say something like that we can never do it by means of imagination, is really to end up embracing a thoroughgoing skepticism about our ability to understand one another's experiences at all. And I think that sort of skepticism seems problematic, and it's one that most of us wouldn't want to embrace. I think in order to interact successfully with one another in the world, we need to try to understand one another. And I think most of us would agree that this kind of effort of understanding one another is important. But if we became convinced that these efforts were futile, that we have no way of understanding one another, no way of knowing anything about the experiences of one another, then why would we even try, right? We would just stop trying to understand because the whole thing is futile. I don't think, in fact, that we regularly regard such efforts as futile. I think we do often think that we can learn about others, that we can gain insight into experiences very different from our own. For example, and this thought was previewed already, but we pick up a good book, right? And in picking up a good book, we learn about experiences very different from our own. And you can think about all different kinds of books that you have read or you might read that really open up windows, right, for you into vastly different experiences from the kind that you've had. So we have philosophers making this kind of point. So this is the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who says that narrative art has the power to make us see the lives of the different with more than a casual tourist interest, with involvement and sympathetic understanding. And I think this sentiment about literature is often expressed as actually capturing part of the value of literature. It's because literature gives us this understanding of one another that it's so valuable to us. And then here's a quotation from former President Barack Obama. He was, in an interview, he was talking about his friendship with the novelist Marilynne Robinson, and he said that when he was reading her books, he was able to draw connections between the people he was seeing every day, the people he was shaking hands with, in his stump speeches, or just out giving, just interacting. And he was able to draw connections between those people and his own grandparents. And he said that the way he was able to draw this connections was through the glimpse to people's interior life that he had gotten from reading books, say, books by Marilynne Robinson and others. So he said, I think that I found myself better able to imagine what's going on in the lives of people throughout my presidency, God, I almost said pregnancy there on the previous topic. Anyway, the lives of people throughout my presidency, because of not just a specific novel, but the act of reading fiction. It exercises those muscles, and I think that has been helpful. Okay, so I think epistemic inaccessibility is a very strong claim. What's claimed in this claim that's my target, what's claimed is not just that it's hard to imaginatively cross experiential divides or that we should be less confident in our ability. What's claimed is that it's impossible to do this. And I guess my modest conclusion at this point is that unless there's an awful lot more to be said than just like, oh, well, you can't imagine what it's like to be a bat, so you can't imagine any experiences other than your own, we haven't really been given reason to believe this sort of conclusion. So are there any other sorts of reasons? Well, I said there were two types of argument. I went through the too big a gulf argument. I want to look at the lack of humility argument. I'm going to do this a little more quickly so we have some time for discussion. The lack of humility argument, I think it's interesting, and I think there's a lot there to say. These arguments I also think are unsuccessful, but I want to explain to you why that is. So here's a quote from a philosopher named Iris Marion Young, and so she says this: when one shows moral humility, one starts with the assumption that one cannot see things from the other's perspective and waits to learn by listening to the other person to what extent they have had similar experiences. She says, if you think you already know how the other people feel and judge because you have imaginatively represented their perspective to yourself, then you may not listen to their expression of their perspective very openly. So that's one expression of this kind of argument, right? Like if you're doing all this imaginative work and you think, oh, well, I know what this other person is feeling, then we shut down and we don't really listen to what they're saying because we think we already know what it's like to be them. We don't listen, we don't engage. There are a couple of things to notice about this quote. I want to give you another passage as well. But first, notice this doesn't really deny that we can learn by imagination, but it makes a prediction about a likely error of relying on our imagination, namely that we're going to be bad listeners, right, if we rely too much on our imagination. Okay, so here's another quotation. This is from Elizabeth Spellman. She says, if we reflect a moment on why imagination may seem necessary in this situation, where a member of an oppressor group is trying to learn about a member of an oppressed group, we can see why it is also dangerous, why imagination is dangerous. If we already knew a lot about each other, I wouldn't have to use my imagination in this way to enter into your world, any more than I would have to understand my own. But if I only rely on my imagination to think about you and your world, I'll never come to know you and it. So this last claim, I think, is not fully defended, that this claim that if I only rely on imagination, I'll never come to know you and it. But there's something interesting about this passage, and maybe in the other passage as well. And it suggests that sort of behind the words here is this suggestion there are better ways of coming to know than by way of imagination, right? If I only rely on imagination, I won't come to know about you and your experiences. I should do something else instead. So this passage, which is suggesting that we not rely on our imagination, seems to be presupposing that there's some way for us to gain the kind of access. And so the question is how? Like, what do we do? So the arguments, I think, these arguments seem to assume a certain incompatibility between imagining and listening. The thought is something like this. Either we can imagine other people's experiences to try to understand them, or we can try to understand them by listening. But there's kind of an obvious rejoinder to that, which is, why can't we do both, right? Why can't we imagine other people's experience and listen to what they're telling us? And in fact, why can't we use what they're telling us to help us be better imaginers? Right? There should be some sort of give and take here between the two processes. And I think imagining is a skill. Some people are better imaginers than others. And we might think that the people who are better imaginers might be better imaginers precisely because they're good listeners. right? That's part of what makes you a good imaginer in this sense, like imagining the interior worlds of others, because you listen to what they tell you, and you think about what they tell you, and that all is work for, or sorry, that's all resources for your imagination. So I think it's probably true that imagination that works in a complete vacuum, right? That's working completely independently of interaction with anyone else. Yeah, that kind of imagination is probably not going to be very good. That is, it's not going to get you the kind of understanding that you're looking for. But there's no reason to think that imagination has to operate in a vacuum. So I think it's important for us to remember that successful uses of imagination are going to be informed by the world, informed by what we're hearing, informed by what we're seeing, informed by what others are telling us that they're hearing and seeing. And now there's going to be some difficult questions here about when exactly and how much we should discount our own beliefs when they conflict with other people's experiences. But the difficulty of that question, right, like how we should balance what we think versus what other people are saying, that doesn't show that there's no way at all to imagine what it's like to be someone else. So this is, I am a philosopher, so I do like to put things in argument form. So this is a little sketch of what the argument might look like, the lack of humility argument. And once we try to spell it out, I think we see it doesn't even establish the conclusion that it's going for. It doesn't even establish the, I mean, even if the argument were, even if the premise of the argument is true, it's not going to get us to the conclusion it wants. The argument would have to go something like this. Imagining what it's like to be another is fraught with danger. Thus, we do best to refrain from imagining what it's like to be another. So at best, what we have here is an argument that we must be careful in employing our imagination to understand others. Absent care, we may become guilty of a lack of humility. And that seems right to me, right? Absent care, we may be guilty of a lack of humility. But that doesn't suggest that we don't have access to the experiential perspectives of anyone else. So I think that there are important insights behind the arguments concerning humility. Moral humility, moral deference, that is, deferring to what other people tell you about their own experiences, that's important. We need to listen to one another, we need to defer, and we need to be humble. All of this is true. But I don't think that any of that suggests any limits on imagination. So for example, here's just one sort of practical piece of this. Let's suppose it does turn out to be, there do turn out to be cases in which we can imagine an experiential perspective that's different from our own. So cases where we do know what it's like to have an experience that we haven't had. That does not mean that what you should do in those cases is start off by just saying to the person, oh, I know exactly how you feel. I've imagined it. I know how you feel. There are all sorts of reasons in lots of circumstances that this is not going to be a good response. In fact, in many circumstances, it's going to be an awful response, right, to tell someone I know how you feel. Why is it an awful response in many circumstances? Well, it can rob the person of their dignity, right? They want to feel a certain uniqueness and dignity. And also, it shifts the conversation. So to say something like, I know how you feel, functions to make the conversation about you and your feelings, right, rather than about them and their feelings. So sometimes this is referred to as a kind of conversational narcissism, right? When you say, I know how you feel, you're making the conversation about you. So that makes it, in many circumstances, not a good response. But I think we can recognize the importance of why we shouldn't say this, right? Like why we shouldn't say, I know how you feel, in some circumstances, why that might be a bad thing to say, without denying the capabilities and reach of imagination. So in other words, there's no inconsistency between saying, hey, there are many cases in which we can know how other people feel, but we shouldn't say that, right? That is, we should listen, and they need to hear sort of other things from us. It was suggested to me when I gave this talk the other day that there might be cases, actually, in which people do want to know that we know how they feel, that can be important to them. And so that's why we might think it's going to depend on the circumstance, and it's going to depend on what's best for the person that you're talking with. So sometimes they need to explain their feelings to you. They need you to listen. And sometimes they need to know that you understand what they're telling you. So there might even be some cases in which saying, I know how you feel, or I think I know how you feel, or I'm trying to imagine how you feel, that might be useful and might be important. It's going to depend on what our conversational partner, how we can best help them to process the experiences that they're having. Okay, so just to return to the questions that I raised at the start, can we have access to experiential perspectives other than our own? Is there a way to bridge what often seems to be an unbridgeable divide? I know you came here today thinking you were going to get all the answers. I don't know if you came here today thinking you were going to get all the answers. I don't have all the answers to this question, but I guess I do think the problem isn't really, insofar as there's a problem here, the problem isn't with the claim that we can imagine across divides, but with a certain kind of overconfidence about the efficacy of those imaginings, or a certain lack of humility or lack of deference when we do it. And ultimately, I think pretty strongly that when we think about trying to understand others, we make a mistake if we give up on the exercise as futile. We need to keep trying. We need to try to understand one another. And in this enterprise, I do think that giving up on imagination is definitely the wrong way to go. So I'll stop there. Thank you. And we can have discussion. So. This is like in my classes when no one has anything. Oh, people do have things to say. Yes.
Thanks so much. This is really, really fascinating.
Cool.
I'm wondering, and your quote from President Obama actually made me wonder this, what the role is for social science research
Okay.
in terms of sort of politicians in particular, but understanding people's experiences. So on the one hand, you might want a representative sample that's generalizable, how many people have experienced this, how do they feel about it. On the other hand, you can imagine some really good focus groups. And those things are quite different than imagination.
Right.
But is there a role for combining these things so that, say, an elected representative might have a sense of, how prevalent something is, or information from a focus group where people are explaining these things, and how does that fit with the theory?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So, one of the things that I'm saying is that we shouldn't think of listening and imagining as incompatible, and that we can be better imaginers by listening. So this sort of focus group, I think, gives us a lot of material for our imagination, to get onto. Now, one thing that I think is maybe in the background of your question is not everyone's going to report it the same way. So if we got 12 people in a room who all were the victims of sexual assault, and even if we picked roughly the same kind of sexual assault or something like that, so we picked cases that were all roughly in the same category, whatever that means, still, their experiences are going to vary dramatically. And I think that's part of why we think it's so hard to imagine what it's like to be someone else, because imagining what it's like to be this person who underwent this experience, that's not the same as imagining what it's like to be this person who underwent the experience, and so on. Because there's going to be just so much to being that person. And so in part I'm shifting it from, say, like imagining what it's like to be Susie, or imagining what it's like to be Bill, or something like that, to thinking about this general aspect of the experience, or the experiential perspective, and learning something about that. And so I would think that focus groups to try and find commonalities would be very helpful. And I would also think that insofar as we find that there are differences amongst people, so that not everyone reports the same kind of experience, that would suggest even more that we need to be even more careful and humble and deferential when we're talking with people. Because even if, that suggests, of course, even if you have been the victim of sexual assault, you might not know what it's like for this other person, because their experience might have been different. So we need to listen. So, yes?
I think a good example is the Starbucks situation
Yes,
right now.
when I was reading that quote, and it's no living law, no doing this, and I was going to add in, no going to Starbucks.
And he met with them, he spent days just listening to their experience and what went on. And as a result, they closed down all the Starbucks to do a day of unbiased training, which is simply a start. But when I saw him on TV, TV. He was so moved, and it impacted him in such an extraordinary way. And he just didn't know till he was open to hearing them.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's a great example. I didn't see the interviews with him, so I don't know how, I didn't know that aspect to the story, but I like what you said at the end. He didn't know because, not just until he heard the stories, but until he was open to hearing the stories, right? And so we not only have to hear, but we have to be open to hearing so that we hear better. And again, I think all of this, so when we just hear, if we're not really listening, then we're not going to be able to do the uptake that we need from what people are telling us. And so you can hear the stories a lot of times, but until you sort of sit down and realize, hey, this is about me too, right? Or hey, this is about my actions too, or this is about what people around me are doing, or whatever, until you sit down and really let in what you're being told, you are going to be able to do the work that you need. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, two quick comments. I've been volunteering for many years as a food pantry. And so I'm a lay person as far as your presentation, but I'm well experienced in seeing a wide range of people that experientially have lived a much different life than I have. And I've gotten very good at prompting and listening, prompting conversation and listening carefully. And it's served me well. The one word that comes to mind when I read the listening and the imagining is the word non-judgmental. Some of the people I work with, it's a challenge for most of us to listen in the terms you're describing, but to do it in a humble, as you say, I would say more non-judgmental. So it's just a comment. The second thing I wanted to add quickly, more relating to imagination, as you were speaking, the thing that popped into my mind, and we've all been to weddings before in our life, and the symptom that there's some imagination going on in the people in attendance is that whether they're young, old, relatives, friends, what have you, married, unmarried, never married, widowed, on and on, you see tears in that group. And to me that's a vivid sign or symptom that there's some serious imagination at a deep emotional level going on. So those are my two comments.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I like the second one, right? Like, what must be going on to enable us to, I like both comments. I'll say something about the second one first and then circle back. Yeah, that connection between emotional responses and imagining, right? We must be transported in some way, right, by the events beyond that are going on around us. And it looks like it's some kind of imaginative transportation that really brings forth that kind of emotional reaction.
But that could be memory.
It could be memory. That's
not
right.
Imagination.
That's right. So in some cases, I think, sure, you might be crying because you're remembering your own wedding, right? Or you're remembering, crying tears of joy, because you're remembering your own wedding, or you're remembering a child's wedding or a friend's wedding. But you might also be at a wedding. I mean, we see people crying, say, who have never been married, and they're crying, like imagining their own futures too, perhaps. So
they might be listening and imagining at the same time.
That's right, right? Like listening to the declarations of love and learning something about what that's like.
It could be instead of memory, I would use the term reimagining.
Right. So, I mean, now we're going to go down a philosophical rabbit hole if we go down this path too long about what exactly distinguishes memory and imagination. And I actually think that the two often can go hand in hand, and that they use similar mechanisms. But certainly, I mean, one way just to get the easy conclusion that some of what's going on in those wedding tears circumstances is not memory is that we can talk about someone who's thinking about the future, right? And if they're thinking about the future, then it's probably not memory. Oh, I just want to say quickly something about your other comment about listening non-judgmentally, which I think is really important. And I get a lot of students, mostly women students in my office, often recently, who have been talking about the troubles they've been having finding people to talk to about their experiences with sexual assault. So one student was in my office, and she had gone to a counselor, and the counselor was asking her questions such that she felt, in her words, it was very victim blaming, right? So even this trained counselor was talking to her in such a way that made it not helpful for her. And so I think it's a skill to be able to listen non-judgmentally, and it's a skill to know how to listen and what to say, because of course we can't be just completely silent conversational partners. And so I think we often don't realize how questions that seem to us to be very neutral or innocent really come across as judgmental. And so there are lots of skills that are going to be involved in being able to talk to one another and understand one another. We need, it turns out that listening and communicating is very hard to do, even to get the material to do the imaginative work that I'm suggesting that we should want to do.
We have time for about one more question.
Only one more? Can I squeeze in
No,
two
I'm
if I don't
sorry.
say much?
Well, we can do two.
Okay, yeah. I can also hang out for a little bit. Go ahead.
So in the corporate world these days, unconscious bias is a big,
Yeah,
big
implicit bias,
conversation.
yeah.
Is imagination sort of one of the tool sets that is being used to combat unconscious bias? I haven't really heard it talked about too much.
It's a great question. I guess I haven't, I guess I'll just say I haven't heard that. I have heard some discussion among philosophers in an attempt to understand what these unconscious or implicit biases really are. Like, so are they beliefs? It seems like they're contrary to our explicit beliefs. So like we might not hold racist beliefs explicitly, but yet we engage in these actions that suggest some sort of implicit bias, some sort of racial something going on. And some philosophers have suggested that maybe implicit biases are more like unconscious imaginings. So we don't quite believe it, but we have these imaginings that are prompting all of these associations. So that would actually be a bad thing about imagination. I'll have to think about whether we could use imagination to combat implicit biases. I guess one of the things that is important, because well, one model of implicit biases is it's associational, and so we need to break the bad associations in order to rid us of implicit biases. And you'd think that imaginative exercises should help us to break those associations. So, okay, last one, I guess.
Yeah. First, I just want to acknowledge you for the work you've been doing on
Thank you.
imagination. I think that's really important, and I appreciate your sharing your thoughts on how we can overcome, some of these divides. I would just like to suggest maybe two nuances to what you shared. First is, I don't think it requires so much imagination as opening ourselves up to the other person and listening. And what I would suggest, because you say we're not sometimes sure, a very powerful thing that's been used for a long time, nonviolent communication by Marshall Rosenberg, where he talks about that and actually experiencing the feelings that the other person is saying. But the other nuance is, no, we never say, I know how you feel, ever. We would never say that. That's like a setup.
Yeah.
You can feel it, and they'll get it if you're actually feeling it. But that's the other thing. We would just never try to say that because it's really a problem, and especially at a funeral, or especially if someone has cancer. Even if you have cancer, you don't know how they actually are feeling. And so I just want to just suggest that it's probably, there's some very good work that's out there that's being widely used to diffuse all kinds of conflict. But I don't think you have to imagine, you just have to really open yourself up, as someone else was saying before.
Yeah, so I mean, I like this idea of opening yourself up, and I guess you were saying opening yourself up to the experiences, and I guess I think of that as sort of imaginatively experiencing what's going on. So maybe it's, I mean, it's not these kind of like flights of fancy
It's
imaginative
actually just
work,
being
but
present.
being present.
Fully.
Well,
Doing
But to
the same thing.
experience empathy, like you're talking about, it seems the only way you can do that is through some imagination, because you don't have that direct experience. So in order to feel any of the emotion or reaction to the experience that someone's sharing with you involves some thought and imagination.
yeah. Well, I mean, I agree, I think. I guess ultimately I would say there are going to be lots of pieces to closing these divides, or sorry, to bridging these divides, lots of different pieces. And so in the discussion we just had, people have added sort of more table, right? So we need not just to listen, but listen non-judgmentally. We need to open ourselves up to the experience. I mean, these are some of the kinds of comments that have come up, and all of this suggests is that it's going to be hard work, right? But what I've been trying to suggest today is the fact that it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible, and it's important for us to believe in the possibility of bridging these divides